That's it. Okay, if everyone could please take their seats. I hope you had an excellent lunch. And now we're in for a treat. And our next speaker, and then after that, we'll have more of an open forum for questions and discussion. Thanks, Brett.
Hope everyone had a chance to get some good lunch and maybe taken a few steps outside to enjoy the sunshine and the fresh air. Having heard from the industry perspective and the environmental perspective, I think that we all can agree these were two very great presentations, and we're so very fortunate to have these speakers here with us today. We're going to bring it home and round out the final segment of our presentation and get sort of the real-life practical experience from one land trust in Pennsylvania who has some real-life experience in having dealt with this very difficult issue. Renee Carey has been with the Northcentral Pennsylvania Conservancy since 1994, working as the land protection specialist before becoming the executive director. She serves on the board of the Pennsylvania Land Trust Association, and additionally she's involved with the Pine Creek Watershed Council, Susquehanna River Heartland Coalition for Environmental Studies, and the Commonwealth's Forest Stewardship Advisory Committee. She holds a degree in general arts and sciences from Penn State University. Please join me in welcoming Renee Carey.
So my job is to keep you all awake for the next half hour after lunch. Earlier today, when we were talking about the panelists, the word expert was used. So to start off with, I am not an expert, but I'm here to share my experience. So to give you an idea of where North Central Pennsylvania is, we're a little farther north than you guys. Here is Pennsylvania. Everything in green is underlain by Marcellus Shale. The light green are the 12 counties that the North Central Pennsylvania Conservancy works in. So as you can see, there's a lot of green in the 12 counties we work in, and some of the counties we work in are entirely green. We hold 44 conservation easements right now. About half of them allow for developmental gas leasing. So Kate was talking about modern fracturing. In Pennsylvania, we talk about surface disturbance. We talk about subsurface development, surface development. So a developmental lease would be where surface development or surface disturbance is allowed. And in Pennsylvania, and I'm going to back up once, we have a history in the western part of the state of shallow gas well development. That shallow gas well development extended into Clinton County. We'll see how good my pointer skills are. And Clinton County actually has a gas storage field, a natural gas storage field. And the gas that's stored there eventually makes its way to New York City. There are shallow gas wells in a lot of those other counties that either didn't produce or weren't producing enough to make them economically viable. So the western counties we work in, Clinton and Northern Center, have had more gas development history than the other counties, but it's not a totally foreign concept to where we work. So when we were doing our early easements, and we were formed in 1990, we were using a model easement from the Brandywine Conservancy, and it allowed for basically shallow gas well development, an acre of clearing, very little infrastructure, those types of things. And it was very specific or prescriptive in what could or couldn't happen. We now use the Pennsylvania Model Conservation Easement, and here's my plug as a PALTA board member. If you go to conservationtools.org, you can get a copy of the model easement used in Pennsylvania, along with a commentary that explains why things are written the way they're written. Our conservation tools, all one word, .org. So half of our easements allow for developmental gas leasing. 24 of our conservation easements are leased. 16 of them are non-developmental, which means no surface disturbance. So you can't have a well pad, you can't have compressor stations, you can't have any of the surface disturbance associated with developing a gas well pad and then drilling the well. 8 of those properties have developmental gas leases, so they would allow for surface disturbance. 5 of the 8 predate the conservation easement, so the gas lease came before the conservation easement. 3 of those are based on shallow gas well development. Again, just to give you a little background and perspective. See all those little pretty colors? And the white? The white are the parcels that aren't leased. This is a part of a township in Tioga County. White means it's not leased. Color is denoting the leasing company. There are 11 different colors on that map. One of the townships in Bradford County, which is the county immediately east of Tioga, 99% of one of the townships was leased. So the way leasing happened in Pennsylvania, my experience with it, and it's, I'm sure, different in every play, the leasing companies came in first, and the leasing companies are just that. It's a company that has no interest or intention in developing a gas well. Their goal is to come in and get as many leases as they can, and then they wait for the drilling companies to come in, and then they go and sell those leases or flip them to a drilling company. The drilling companies will also lease, and then after a lot of leasing has happened, they'll have conversations and swap leases or sell leases back and forth to try to consolidate to get a drilling unit. At least that's what's happened in Pennsylvania. One of the properties that we have under easement the lease has flipped 8 times, and that was in an 18-month period. So when we go to do our stewardship visits in a given county, part of that stewardship visit is at least once a year we go to the county register and recorders. In Pennsylvania, the gas lease is required to be recorded, and we check to see who currently holds that gas lease. The leasing companies that came in, that again, this was just a for-profit enterprise that had no interest or intention in drilling. They were just trying to get leases so they could sell those. They have shareholders in India, New Zealand, and all kinds of wonderful places. So some of the gas leases that are non-developmental on properties we have under easement, there are interest holders in India and New Zealand that hold interest in those gas leases. So, again, looking at all the white, there's not a lot there. So after a lot of conversation and visits to a couple of gas well pads, this is where my board came down. If we're going to continue protecting the working farms and forests of north central Pennsylvania, which is what we intend to do, we're going to have to figure out a way to work in Marcellus Shale, because there's not enough unleased that we can say we're only going to work on unleased properties. That just wasn't practical. So how can we approach this in what we hope is a rational and logical framework? So we started talking about, well, okay, we can monitor for and we can look at surface impacts. So those surface impacts we're looking at, how do those compare to other activities that are already going on in our area, in our region? We started talking about pipelines and roads going into well pads and how those are similar to the haul roads and landing areas used in logging operations. Tried to find things that are similar in the surface disturbance. One, to try to help remove the emotion, because we realized we had to be rational and logical about this, because we may at some point in time have to defend our decisions in court. So what can we compare this to that we're already doing and look at those impacts? To give you an idea of what's happened so far, we started in our area with seismic testing. So seismic testing is basically where they create vibrations at the surface and then measure how those vibrations go down through the ground. And if you're a geologist and have been trained to do so, you can look at the little squiggly lines, and that tells you what's down there. They do this to get an idea on the depth of the Marcellus Shale in our region and how far down that shale is, because the depth helps them to determine where they want to drill and how productive a well might be. If it's a shallow amount of Marcellus Shale, it's probably not worth going in and drilling it. If it's a deeper amount of Marcellus Shale, it's more likely to be productive. So the seismic testing that was done in our area was primarily done with little explosive charges. They would run these in predetermined lines, and you would have, I live in Montoursville, Pennsylvania, and we have the regional airport, and the way they did it in our region is they would get these big bags and fill them with wires and charges, and the helicopter would pick up the big bag at the Williamsport Airport, fly it to a predetermined drop location, drop it off, and the guys in the field would start laying the wires and the charge lines. And then after a certain area was mapped out and all the charges were laid, they would detonate those charges and measure the vibrations. So the seismic testing, in some instances, this is all contracted out. None of this is done by the literal drilling company. These are other companies that do the seismic testing. Some of it was done under contract with the drilling companies. Other seismic testing companies go and get the data, and then they sell it to any drilling company that wants to buy it from them. 14 of the properties we have under easement have had seismic testing done on that we know of. 12 of those companies did a surface use agreement with us. And we outlined terms and conditions for what would have to happen for the seismic testing to happen. We followed up on all 12 of those properties, and there didn't seem to be any problems. There was a little bit of flagging left on one, but it was pretty minor, and it appeared like it wasn't tied to anything. It fell out of somebody's pocket. 2 of the properties did not have surface use agreements. On the one instance, the property owner, let it happen and just didn't tell us. And the other one was one of those moments every easement monitor dreads. Charlie, who works part-time for us, showed up to do his annual easement inspection, and there's the young French-Canadian guy setting charges on the Vischer easement. The landowner didn't know because it's not an owner-occupied property. So Charlie and the young French-Canadian gentleman had a very nice conversation, and Charlie contacted his supervisor and explained, and went back out the next day, and all sign of them was gone. From what we can tell, they just pulled everything up and left and didn't do the seismic testing on that property. So seismic testing came first. After seismic testing, the companies start looking at where they're going to put their well pads. And real quick on the left-hand side, we're saying that, you know, we have a protected property, the well pads on an adjacent property. They drill down, they turn, they go into the Marcellus Shale. So again, there's no surface activity on the protected property, but you would have the hydraulic fracturing happening along the well bore. So the map on the right is our Robwood Mountain Conservation Easement is in green, and this is in Bradford County. That is the map of the drilling unit. There's a red and white hashed property down here. That property is not leased. That landowner did not sign a lease. Everybody around them did. The well for this lease, or for this drilling unit, is off the property, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. But again, a portion of one of our protected properties is part of this unit. It doesn't have any surface disturbance, but there is drilling activity going on underneath the surface. Pipelines. So I think it was Kate that referenced a study TNC, the Nature Conservancy, has done. Nels Johnson out of the Pennsylvania office has done several different studies and data crunching on the impacts from Marcellus shale gas or natural gas development. Pipelines are going to be the #1 impact. I don't remember the exact figures, and I tried finding them last night and couldn't online. So Bradford County, Pennsylvania has kind of sort of been ground zero in our region for Marcellus shale gas. In 2010, I believe it was, there were roughly 300 miles of pipeline. By 2012, that was 900. So they need the pipelines to get the gas to market. And you start with a line that's taking the gas from the well to a larger line, to a larger line, to a major transmission line. So it's a whole network and grid. So 2 companies have proposed pipelines on properties we hold conservation easements on. The first property, which the map is of, the gas lease predates the easement. So this is the Nicholas easement in Tioga County. The red X, her neighbor got the well pad, and they were proposing by the orangish line, taking the gathering line from that well pad across Mrs. Nicholas and up. We met with the company that was doing the pipeline layout, which was a subcontractor to the drilling company. And Charlie met with them on site and showed them a few things that we thought they would want to be aware of, such as drain tiles in the farm fields and the stream crossing and some other things. They actually agreed to some modifications to where they were going to run the line because they tend to go straight up and straight down. They apparently don't use maps that show the contours. They just draw lines. What happened then is, speaking of leases being flipped, that well was then flipped to another company, and that other company had other properties up here, so they actually ran this line north instead of across Mrs. Nicholas. The second property, the pipeline was proposed. The property owner contacted us with the information. We contacted the company and said, you can't do it because it's surface disturbance and it's not a pipeline that would be servicing a unit this property is part of. And we never heard back. So we're assuming that they took that as a no and figured out another way to work around that situation. 4 companies have proposed wells, drilling wells on protected properties. This is the Van Horn Homestead easement. And you can see this large field is where they wanted to put it. The Van Horn Homestead easement is based on, the language in that easement is based on the shallow gas well development. So they're allowed up to 1 acre of clearing. Because it's in a pre-existing field, they wouldn't have needed to clear anything. We provided the company with a copy of the surface use agreement because this is a lease that came after the conservation easement. And the company said, thank you, but we think we'll go talk to the neighbor. And they did, and the neighbor got the well pad instead of this property. So that worked out. Then there are 2 properties that, that they don't have well pads on them yet. So that map that I showed earlier of the drilling unit, and it had a green splash in it, this is the property that was green. So this corner down here is part of that unit that I showed you. This is our Robwood Mountain Conservation Easement, and it's several parcels, and it's a couple hundred acres, and the easement prohibits surface development. The gas lease prohibits surface development. It's a non-surface disturbance gas lease. And Mr. Bride got a letter from the company saying, we've selected your property for a well pad. We put a stake up. There's pink ribbon. Please contact so-and-so if you have any questions. So Mr. Bride, being Mr. Bride, didn't contact so-and-so. He called Charlie and asked Charlie to contact so-and-so. So Charlie first went up and checked, and sure enough, there's a stake in the ground. There's pink ribbon in the tree. Charlie went to the company with a copy of the conservation easement and a copy of the lease. And the company apologized profusely. One of the things you have to keep in mind with a lot of the large companies, and again, there are exceptions to every rule, a lot of the large companies, there are silos. So you have the silo that the geologists are in, and the geologist's job are to figure out where you want to put wells, and they'll give you a general area. They turn that information over to another silo, and that silo gets this information, and they go out and put stakes in the ground where that is and figure out where the well pads are physically going to go. Then there's another silo that comes out and does its job, and so on and so on and so on. So there's, in some companies, doesn't seem to be a lot of cross-communication. So the woman got the data from the geologist, but it wasn't her job to look to see what properties they could do surface activity on and which ones they couldn't. The last one, I have a couple of slides on. This is the Shedden Conservation Easement. It's in Bradford County. This is a major east-west route through Bradford County, Route 14, and down here is Towanda Creek. The gas lease predates the easement. So the gas lease came, the property owners who had it were a Mennonite couple, decided to move to Ohio, sold the property to the folks who ended up donating the conservation easement to us. That gas lease allows surface disturbance, and it's a standard boilerplate gas lease. There doesn't appear to have been any negotiation whatsoever. So this field is up here above the house, and that is a bunch of hay and the white plastic covering the big round bales, just to give you some perspective. So the property owner got notice that the company wanted that his property had been selected for a well pad, and this is where the well pad was going to be. He forwarded the information to us. We realized it was going to be about 7,500 cubic yards of dirt that was going to need to be moved to create the well pad. So we met with the company and talked to them about alternative locations and explained about a small wetland that was so small it didn't show up on the National Wetland Inventory, about our concerns about how visible this was going to be, scenic view shed, as well as the amount of earth moving. Because again, moving dirt is where we see a lot of the problems with the ENS. So they came up with a couple of alternatives and gave those to the landowner. And he opted for this one, which again, it's going to put it closer to his house and his neighbor's house, but it's less than 5,000 cubic yards of soil to be removed. It's less of a road to be built, and it puts it down lower, so it's not going to be as visible. The plans were put together. Chesapeake had some, it was with Chesapeake. Chesapeake has had some financial problems. This has not been developed yet, but we're told that later this year more is going to happen. And this lease has also been flipped to another company. Anadarko actually holds the lease now. One of the things Jason asked me and thought that folks would be interested in was an idea of how much time and effort this has taken. What have the costs been to the Northcentral Pennsylvania Conservancy? So all the photos are from the shed and easement. That's Leo's brother's cows, his barn, his brother making hay and doing stuff on the property. So Shedden is the one where we anticipate getting the gas well sometime this year with Anadarko. The easement was donated in 2007. 2009, a typical easement inspection year, nothing wrong, 3.5 hours was spent on the property. 2010, 2011, that's when we were discussing with them the potential location of the well pad and how that was going to all work and play out. 2012, again, pretty much a typical year because they were in the process of making some financial plans and doing some other things. It increased in 2013 because of a mitigation project that's going on the property. To give you some idea, I'm the only full-time staff person in our office. Charlie's part-time, and we have a part-time admin person. So again, to give you some perspective, that literally over 2 weeks in 2011 was spent just on this project with our staff. Bride Farm, and I apologize, I had Robwood Mountain and Bride Farm up here, and when I was editing, I wanted to make it big enough so you could see. Robwood Mountain was the property in Bradford County I'd been talking about. Bride Farm is also owned by Mr. Bride. It's in close proximity. So you can see 26.25 hours in 2009. That was when they were doing seismic testing and negotiating the actual lease that ended up on the property and doing some other things. It dropped down slightly. That's one that 10 hours is probably average for that one, in all honesty, because Mr. Bride's a nice old man, and we spend lots of time talking to him and checking his bluebird boxes with him. But, you know, so 26.25 for the leasing and the seismic testing that was going on. Again, Charlie made less than $12,000 last year. He was exempt from our local services tax, to give you an idea of how much of his time this is taking and how much he actually works. So that's where we are. Kate showed some similar photos, but just to give you guys an idea, because I wasn't sure what all you may have seen or heard about, some of the other impacts from natural gas exploration in Pennsylvania. And unless I say otherwise, all of these photos were taken by Charlie Schwarz on our staff. So you've got the construction of roads and well pads, so lots of dirt being moved. You've got the drilling operation going on in the daytime. You've got the drilling operation going on in the nighttime. Once they start, it's 24 hours, 7 days a week. They don't stop for Christmas. They don't stop for New Year. You keep going unless there's a problem. So they do put up a lot of lighting because, again, it's an industrial work site. You want to make sure the folks on the ground can see what they're doing. Some of the companies will pile up, so those really big rectangular bales of hay. They'll pile those up as high as they can and still be safe to help block some of the light and noise from neighboring property owners. Some of them have done that, some of them don't. But you can, so driving on 15 South from New York to Pennsylvania, for a while you could see lights along the ridge because there were 2 or 3 different drilling operations going on state forest land along that ridge. This is a photo from Texas of the fracking procedure. We tend to use this one because it is more of the bird's eye view. All of those trucks would have water, sand, or chemicals in them so that they can be mixed together and pumped down the hole. This is probably the most industrial part of the process. And again, once they start, they can't stop. And pipeline installation. Again, this is going to be where you see a lot of the impact. And again, there have been pipelines in Pennsylvania for a long time, but we're getting more of them. And things we talk about with pipelines are, I think the term is double trenching, so that as you scoop the dirt out, the stuff that's on top gets set to the side and gets put back on top, that you don't put it back in reverse order. You want to make sure the topsoil is on top so that stuff can grow back on top of it. Here's a well pad in production. So again, this was a farm field. You can see the well pad here. You can see a tank that's probably holding the production water that's coming off of it. You know, again, once the drilling rig and stuff's out of there, a lot of times, depending on who does the reclamation, it's not as noticeable. Charlie took this whole series of photos, and you can follow, starting up here, you've got the tree line, over to it being seeded. There's the wellhead, the Christmas tree. Just a wellhead, and then eventually some other stuff was added to it. So again, depending on who does the reclamation and what the surface use agreement and gas lease say. And pipelines. So again, they'd like to go straight up and straight down, shortest distance, but there are other reasons for that, I guess, as well. They can be reclaimed. In Pennsylvania, this winter, several pipelines became downhill ski slopes and local sledding hills and are finding a variety of uses. We also see, according to some of the wildlife conservation officers I've been talking to, seen an increase in deer poaching because you can shoot longer and straighter. And the companies are, the National Wild Turkey Federation, Ruffed Grouse Association are promoting using native grasses to help with wildlife habitat. So again, it's one of those catch-22s. You now have a cleared opening. What kind of wildlife can use that? Can we use it to create new wildlife habitat? You can, it's working, however, that's increasing poaching. So this photo is also of a pipeline, and this is in the Pine Creek watershed. This pipeline was put in, this photo is from 1970. And we use this one just because it's got the sign in it. This is where we're seeing a lot of the impacts on pipelines after they've been revegetated. ATVs, four-wheelers, dirt bikes. Some guys have even tried to take their, jacked up pickup trucks. That doesn't work as well. But this is the type of erosion and use that we're seeing, in addition to the skiing. So before I talk a little bit about our surface use agreement, just real quick, here's a well pad, there's a well pad. So Charlie took two photos and stitched them together. This is what we were seeing in one area of Bradford County. This is how far the wells were being placed, and they were trying to tuck them in along the hillside. If the conservation easement predates the gas lease, we require a surface use agreement. It's three parties, us, the company, and the landowner. And so we get into things that how many well pads will be there. We say one well pad, but you can put multiple wells on it. Access roads, because they tend to, the surface width can't exceed 20 feet. It's easier for them to make them bigger and wider because that gives them more room to work in. So some conditions on how wide they can be. All the wells have to be drilled and completed within 3 years. Something else we saw in our region is they would go in and just drill a well, but they wouldn't frack it because once they drilled the well, they could hold the unit by production. And again, some of this has to do with Pennsylvania law. It may differ in Virginia based on what your laws say. The final production area can't be more than 1 acre, and this is a well being flared. We were talking about that earlier. They flare the wells to get a volume measurement, and there's a whole scientific procedure on how long you flare it and what you measure coming off of it. So I want to say it's like 24 or 48 hours that they'll flare a well, and again, that's straight through because they're measuring how much gas burns off in that time period. Well pads have to have spill containment systems. Here's a side shot. They put down gravel, a liner, another liner, some more stuff, and then it's a non-skid surface on top. On this well pad, everything drained to this corner, and this tank was catching all of that water, filtering out any sediment from it, and then the water was getting pumped off. We don't allow mud pits, and a lot of the companies in Pennsylvania are no longer using them, either because of the bad press or the amount of accidents that were happening with mud pits. It has to be a contained system. All the water has to be stored in tanks, not in pits. The flowback water should be recycled. And we say should because a couple of things. One, every geologist I've spoken to has told me there is no way to tell after a property has been fracked whether or not it was fracked. You can take measurements during the fracking process based on the chemicals you put in it. You can track their movement, but after something's been fracked, you can't tell that it was fracked. So we can't monitor for that. We also don't want to be responsible for water after it tries to leave the site to try to track it and figure out where it went to. So we say should be recycled versus must be recycled. And earlier, so there were some municipal water companies that were taking the water, some sewage treatment plants, and trying to process it because they didn't really realize what was in it. there's enough brine naturally occurring in Pennsylvania that this was really salty water, and it really messed up some of the bacteria in some of the sewage treatment plants. Some of them had to shut down for several weeks till they could get things back in balance. There are at least 2 for-profit companies that are recycling wastewater, so they treat it to a certain level, and then the companies take it and reuse it. The NORM, the naturally occurring radioactive material, Pennsylvania also has a radon issue. So the coal mining history, you've got radon in people's homes. That, my understanding, is again why we have so much NORM in Pennsylvania. So flowback water, the pipelines and road corridors. On state forest land in Pennsylvania, they've declared that the pipelines have to parallel the roads. So that makes for really good road hunting, going back to the poaching. But there is some conversation and debate on whether or not that is a good thing for wildlife. From the standpoint that it's now a wider opening, so there are some species that are less likely to cross that opening. And again, I'm not a wildlife biologist, but folks are now looking at, would you be better off not putting the pipelines parallel to the road from a wildlife standpoint? This is a shallow gas well that was no longer producing, so that's the photo. This is also on state forest land, but it was the best photo Charlie could find. Our surface use agreement says once you get down to 1,000 cubic feet of gas, you're done. And again, in the shallow gas well fields in Pennsylvania, the experience was the larger companies held on to them for a while, and then once they stopped producing at a certain scale, the larger companies sold them to smaller companies, to smaller companies, to smaller companies, till you got down to some very small company that it was cheaper for them to give up the bond than to remediate the well site. So we're still leaving at 1,000 cubic feet. Most companies would still consider that a producing well. So we are trying to figure out a way to balance natural gas extraction, because we know it's not going to go away in Pennsylvania. So now that that is literally part of our landscape, how can we protect the landscape? Forest fragmentation, this is state forest land. This is a hunting club. The ridge is pretty much the division. You can see all the little well pads, all the pipelines and access lines. There was still, when they were doing open water pits, again, the large well pads on steep slopes. This is a better shot showing you the cut and fill that's being done. Large freshwater impoundments that are springing up in various places. And the mud pits, Charlie snuck in to take this photo, so I can't tell you where it is, but it is in Pennsylvania. So they lined the mud pit, which was all well and good until this guy either had a fight with his girlfriend or was mad at his boss, because here's the edge of the liner. This is where the water's being discharged. So again, so much of this comes down to the person actually doing the job on the ground and how good of a job they're willing to do. We've had accidental discharges. This is surfactant that was released from a drilling operation on state forest land. It's coming down the hillside, going under Route 44 and into Pine Creek. And this was in April, about a week before trout season started in Pennsylvania. Pipeline constructions over streams and wetlands. 150-foot plus pipelines and roads that are being built. Another issue is companies not sharing their pipelines or right-of-ways. So again, here you have 2 pipelines, but this photo really, again, you know, there doesn't seem to be with some of the companies as much sharing and cooperation as there are with other companies. Spread of invasive species, whether it's on some guy's boot, on a truck, or just because you disturb the soil and now that seed source is going to get, you know, an opportunity to expand and spread. But as was said earlier, there's been methane in water in Pennsylvania for hundreds of years. One of my former board members worked with a farm family who had to shut down their dairy operation, and this was in the early 90s, because of the level of methane in their water source. And they had to go through the whole bankruptcy process, and he worked with them on that. So it's looking at that, you know, almost DNA footprint, if you will, of the gas that's showing up in well water. And is it the deep stuff or is it the shallow stuff? Because we've got the shallow stuff in water sources now in Pennsylvania. And I didn't realize this in Pennsylvania before drilling starts, and this goes back to the shallow gas well, before drilling starts, every residential water well within a certain distance from that well has to be tested by an independent lab paid for by the company, with the results going to the company and the homeowner. And Penn State Cooperative Extension has done a whole landowner education series on well water and what the parameters are, what they mean, and a lot of labs have set up field stations in Williamsport because a lot of people have also gone out and gotten their own set of water quality data testing done. So I know I'm over time. Charlie was originally going to do this presentation, but he had a slight mishap and couldn't be here today, so I got to step in for him. But this is one of his favorite quotes from Northern Woodlands magazine, so it seemed appropriate to keep it in here. And thank you all very much for your time and consideration today. I think I learned as much as you all did. Thank you. Any questions? And I guess it's any questions for... I think you have to go up to the mic so that they can record it and have it as part of the webcast.
Good afternoon. Again, my name is Mary Trout, and I come from the Shallow District of King George County. I've been getting a lot of feedback. There's a lot of people that are watching this from work and from their homes or that have small children, and they were wanting to know if any of the presenters, including yourself in particular, if you can provide this PowerPoint slide presentation either on your website or their website. Or
it's going to be on VOF's website? Everything should be up next week.
The citizens of King George really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you.
I just have two quick questions.
Okay, I think they need your name and where you're from, though.
My name is Kim Sandum. I'm in Rockingham County. Would you define a drilling unit in Pennsylvania? I know it's different in Virginia, but I'm curious about Pennsylvania. And then the other question is, how long have you been enforcing leases? How long have you been dealing with fracking on your conservation easements? Is that a fairly new thing that you've done, or is it something you've been at a while?
So I'm going to guesstimate that it's been since 2000, well, I went too far, 2008, 2009, since a lot of the Marcellus activity started in our area. Prior to that, while our easements allowed for shallow gas well development, there wasn't really much of the shallow gas well development going on. And then, some geologists somewhere realized the Marcellus was there and technology had reached a point where they could now get at it in a cost-effective manner. If you watch natural gas prices, once they started to drop, the drill rigs moved from our area of Pennsylvania more over to western Pennsylvania, because the shale gas in western Pennsylvania is what they call wet gas, so they can get byproducts like butane and propane and stuff like that off of it. That was more economically viable for them than drilling in the Marcellus. So a drilling unit in Pennsylvania, and that's a good question because, again, there's a lot of state law and definitions that come into play here. In the Marcellus region, I want to say they average about 640 acres. And that's off the top of my head trying to remember. And they pretty much run in this orientation, which would be northwest to southeast. And they seem to be pretty consistent in that. So, again, something with the geology that makes them want to run them that way. And the well bores, you think of a wagon wheel spoke, but they don't seem to really do that. They seem to run 3 or 4 northeast and 3 or 4 northwest and 3 or 4 southeast. There's another gentleman walking up to the podium, or to the speaker, I should say.
Good afternoon. I'm Tommy Blackwell. I'm the tax collector in Essex County. And I was curious, I deal in property values quite a bit. Can you address what you've seen as valuation of easements, either pre or post lease lands that have been eased?
With the conservation easements themselves, we haven't really seen much of a change in value. However, property that is not encumbered by easements, people suddenly feel their property is way more valuable than it was before. And we, in addition to the conservation easements, we also do acquisition work. We don't own the property long term, but we'll buy it and then work with one of our state agencies and convey it to them. That has almost completely dried up because either folks want so much more for it because of the Marcellus Shale, or they have severed the oil, gas, and mineral rights and want to sell the surface but not the subsurface. And the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, to remember I'm also in a Commonwealth now, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania has a lot of issues right now related to where property they own the surface on but not the subsurface, and what the subsurface owners want to do to extract their rights. So the Commonwealth basically isn't interested in this point at buying anything that's been severed. But that brings up an interesting point that I forgot to mention. At least in the Marcellus region, there was a housing crisis because the way the development happened in Pennsylvania is you have a lot of people from outside the area come in initially till local folks can get trained up in how to do these different jobs. And for instance, in Tioga County, an apartment that was renting for roughly $300 7-8 years ago is now renting for $700 plus a month. So there were housing issues, and the Pennsylvania Housing Finance Agency hired 2 professors from Lycoming College. They got the RFP to do a housing impact study. Dr. Jason Weigel, his PhD research at Penn State University, was looking at the community impacts from the Marcellus Shale, and he referenced a lot of literature that looks at where you have a new Army base come in. It's the same kind of thing. Young transient male population, and a lot of the things that can go, no offense guys, but a lot of the things that can go along when you do suddenly have a large group of young men getting paid a lot of money and not a lot else to do. Because that's the other thing. These guys are working 14 days on, 7-8 days off. And those 14 days on, a lot of them are spending those 14 days on the well pads. They work their 12 hours, they sleep for 12 hours, they work for 12 hours, and they do that for 14 days straight. One of the things Jason asked me about was the impacts to the local economy and the local workforce. So I can give you 2 examples, and again, I'm not an expert, my experience. My brother is an equipment operator with the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation. So he should be driving a plow truck today because we got ice in PA, but he had rotator cuff surgery. So he runs heavy equipment for PennDOT. Prior to the Marcellus Shale coming in, they didn't have to do anything to hire seasonal plow truck drivers. They had a list. They had more than enough guys. They're advertising on the radio, they're putting posters up, they're holding job fairs. If you have a CDL in the Marcellus Shale gas region and you're not working, it's because you don't want to. City Bus out of Williamsport was advertising for drivers and mechanics. Same thing if you're a diesel mechanic. My one nephew is a diesel mechanic, and where he worked now came up with a rule that if your truck was being worked on, you could not be in the truck bay because there were too many guys passing out cards for the company they worked for, and they were losing too many diesel mechanics that way. One of my board members owns a more or less a catalog call center, he and his family. So when you call to order your swimsuit in a couple of weeks for spring, you may be calling Mildred, Pennsylvania, which is right in the middle of Sullivan County, and talking to one of his employees. He had quite a few people that came to him when this was initially happening saying, I really like working here, but I have debt from, having a baby without health insurance, some stupid stuff I did when I was younger, divorce, whatever. I have this pile of debt, and I know I can go to work in the gas industry and clear that debt up. And they did. Some of them came back to him after a year or 2, because you're not just working in the Marcellus Shale gas. My cousin's ex-brother-in-law works for Halliburton. Chris is hardworking, very mechanically inclined. He has been all over Canada, Alaska, and the U.S. with Halliburton. He started out in the Marcellus Shale, but he's not worked more than 1 or 2 shifts in the Marcellus Shale. Same with other guys I know. They start out in the Marcellus Shale, they end up in Texas, and get flown home for their 10 days off. So some other stuff to kind of think about.
Thank you.
I'm Alice Welpert. I own property in Essex County. I have a question about pipelines and how they get built. Does the company apply for eminent domain if they don't have the route that they want to go? How do they get it approved?
Some of this is going to depend on state law. So in Pennsylvania, the gathering lines, the lines that go from the well pad to some of the bigger lines, you don't have eminent domain authority in Pennsylvania. I don't know about Virginia. A pipeline that crosses state lines and is carrying gas, like in our instance, the Transco pipeline, where I had the lovely photo of the ATV tracks going up over, because it crosses state lines and of the size that it is, they do have eminent domain power for the larger lines. They try not to use it, but they do have it.
If you have a conservation easement on a piece of property, in that particular eminent domain situation, can they still void the conservation easement if it's in that specific time? But any other within the state, then the conservation easement would protect you. I would assume from
eminent domain, whether it's for a pipeline or a road project, trumps a conservation easement. So in Pennsylvania, most of the eminent domain takings have not been related to pipelines, but the Pennsylvania Turnpike, where they've done expansion projects and had to condemn portions of farms protected by easement along the turnpike.
But that would be for public, not for private profit.
My understanding is the Public Utility Commission views the transport of natural gas across state lines as public benefit because of it being a fuel and heating source.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. But that, while he walks up, that brought up another interesting point. One of our easements, they drilled the well and then decided to figure out their pipeline, and they couldn't get a pipeline, so there's a well drilled in Tioga County, and they have no way to get the gas out. Go ahead. And again, I think so. I'm looking at the AV guys. Okay. And again, Mike and Kate can take questions too. I don't mean to hog the Q&A session. I'll try to talk into it closer. I feel like, okay, I'll try. Raise your hand if you can't hear me.
Hi, my name is Pete Glubiak. My question is, you started out making the practical decision with the land trust that so much of the area was covered by leases that you sort of had to work with it. I think what VOF and their board are looking at now is how do you do that? Somebody comes to you and says, I'd like to think about putting an easement on my property, but I'd also like to reserve the right to drill for oil and gas. Where do you go from there? Where do you steer them? I mean, you've obviously got points of view and what you'd like them to do.
Right.
How do you make a decision as an entity? What makes sense? What doesn't make sense? How do you control it? Obviously, you're requiring surface use agreements, reviewing those, doing things. But what, given the fact that there's 95% leased property, how do you make that decision? Where do you go from that initial phone call saying, I'd like to talk to you about an easement?
So the first thing we are now asking people, it used to be, are you the only owner of the property? Because you get so many people that own a property with their brother or sister.
And do you have a bank involved?
And do we what?
And do you have a bank involved?
A bank involved,
That's the
yes.
second question.
Yes, yes. So now the first question is your property leased? Who's it leased with? What kind of lease is it? Is it surface disturbance or non-surface disturbance? Can we get a copy of that? If the property is already leased, we look to see who the lease is held by. We go to the courthouse and make sure it's really held by who they think it's held by, and start to try to reach out to that company, because we realize if we're going to do an easement, we're going to need to negotiate with that company and see if they are willing to say, we will limit or prohibit drilling along the stream corridor, and we'll only put a well pad in this field up here if we're going to do anything. So we start to reach out and talk to the company. We're talking to one landowner now that the property's leased for oil and gas development, but our bigger concern is the gravel because of how much rock they need for these well pads and everything. And we've told the landowner, we're still interested in pursuing a conservation easement with you because you adjoin other properties we're protecting. You have so much of the stream corridor. There's a lot of conservation value here, but you may not get a tax deduction for this donation. And we won't be able to get any type of public funding in Pennsylvania for this because of the pre-existing gas lease and the probability of gravel pits developing on the property. So, yep.
Matt Garrett from Essex County, and I think he touched on it with his answer, but it concerns what clout do you have in trying to get an easement, and when you have an easement, but there was a pre-existing oil and gas lease, what clout do you have with the oil company?
None. It's a would you please consider more than anything. What we found with a lot of the larger companies is a lot of them have some type of community service outreach component. And whether you think they do it because they want to be good corporate citizens or you think they do it because they want the press, there is a certain amount of interest in doing the right thing and being recognized as doing the right thing. So if you're dealing, I almost think with some of the larger companies, it'll be an easier sell to at least get some changes or some considerations to those pre-existing gas leases than it might be with the smaller companies.
Do you ever get them to modify that oil and gas lease on record?
We have not yet. I don't know if any land trusts have, but that's certainly something we would hope to be able to accomplish.
Another question that you might not have the expertise, but maybe somebody on the panel. Once you had the actually fracking by the industry definition done and the well is producing, what type of pressurized pumps exist after that, and how long do they run? In other words, are they continuously creating pressure? How loud are those type of pumps?
Mike
Mike has an answer for me this time. Good, thank you, Mike.
Could you step up to the podium, please? As I understand it, once the natural gas is to the production stage, they want to try to get that into the process of natural gas flow as it already occurs through gathering lines and pipelines and so forth. And somewhere along the way there, that I think goes into kind of a pumping or compressor type stations that helps move the natural gas out into the public domain. So, how much pressure? I'm sure that has to be, modified or varied based on, where they are, how long is the pipeline, where is it going, and that type of thing.
So, but at the site is my specific question, and once the well is producing, you've put pressure on it in the first 3 or 5 days, and now a year later, is there localized equipment creating pressure to bring the gas out of the ground?
I think what you'll see there is that Christmas tree setup, and then sometimes you'll have compressors and separation tanks and that type of thing. It varies from well to well, but I think that in answer to your question in general, they're going to be analyzing and modifying as needed whatever that pressure is, so that it fits and collates with the natural gas pipeline.
I see head shaking behind. Are there community complaints concerning that after noise on the on-site wells?
So in Pennsylvania, most of my experience comes from, in this instance, comes with state forest land. And the one district forester was telling us the company has come back in 5 and 6 different times to adjust some noise dampening systems that they put in place. This was a fairly remote well, but the concern was the impacts to wildlife. Again, I'm not familiar with it. Doesn't mean there aren't complaints about it in residential areas, but I'm not familiar with any. And as Mike said, the compressor stations, it depends on how the gas is coming out of the ground.
Thank you.
Hi, Walter Rowland from Essex County. I had a comment on this lady's question about whether in Virginia, and it varies by state, the conservation easement would trump, the eminent domain. Mm-hmm. Well, it depends on whether who holds the easement. In my experience as a lawyer, I have a property that had the easement was held by the Department of Historic Resources. Now, under Virginia law, in order for the utility, a public utility, to cross that land, they have to make reasonable accommodation to avoid, that property. So if I had an actual experience, I didn't like the idea of the power company putting some more poles, running electric power lines. So they had to change their plans. So I don't think you can say categorically that your easement does not protect you. And what you should do is be sure that you have all the elements ahead of time so that eminent domain does not affect you as much. One other question, that was just a comment, but
It was a good comment.
well, I hope it helps you. One other thing, what's the range of royalties in Pennsylvania for extraction, and can you escalate those based on a formula, based on wellhead prices in Saudi Arabia or something?
So I'm going to back up a little bit because something Mike had said about the signing bonuses. Signing bonuses were, in 2008, really high. Some people were getting $2,000 to $2,500 an acre to sign a gas lease. They're back to $25 to $50 an acre because so much of it's been leased that at this point the companies have enough to do what they need to do. So those prices have dropped. The royalties, one of our easement donors was, in 1 year, received over $1 million in royalties. He gave it all to Catholic Charities because he didn't want it.
Wow. I'll give you my card.
But yeah, it comes down to the price of gas on the market and how the lease is written, because some of the leases were written that production costs could come out before royalties were paid, and so some of the companies are starting to pull those production costs out, so people's royalty checks have gone down. An observation from a local banker is people spend money the way they always spend money. In Tioga County, people are just bouncing checks for larger amounts than they used to. So, yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Oh.
Hi, I'm Nancy Long with Caroline County Countryside Alliance. I have a question. I'm not sure who to address it to. I understand your issue with so many properties being already leased, and you're trying to get conservation easements, and you have to work around that and try to make the best of both worlds. However, in this area, this is just starting. We still have a lot of open. How do you adjust your easements as far as tax credits? I'm all for easements here in the wonderful, beautiful state of Virginia, but I'm not going to be for my tax money paying someone to put in an easement and then let them get royalty checks on the other side at the cost of the land and what we're trying to conserve. So how do you adjust that with your tax credits and your easements?
So all of our easements are donated. The area of Pennsylvania I work in does not have a lot of public funding available for conservation easements. So I'm going to punt to somebody from VOF if they want to take that question or respond later as to what some of their thinking is. Our go-to at this point when we send out a draft conservation easement is leasing is allowed, but non-surface disturbance leasing. Because so the other thing with hydraulic fracturing is you can't control how far the fractures go. It's geology. You can guesstimate how far they're going to go or estimate how far they're going to go. So we recognize that people are going to lose gas if fractures are occurring near them. So we would prefer for the property owners to be able to lease and maybe have some control over what happens underneath the property, even though we can't monitor for that, and that they are at least compensated. The state of New York has forced pooling, and I don't know what Virginia has. Pennsylvania does not have forced pooling. With forced pooling, once a company has a certain percentage of a unit under lease, after a company has a certain sorry, it feels like I'm right on top of it. After a company has a certain percentage of a unit under lease, they can petition the state in New York to basically force the rest of the people into the pool. Pennsylvania doesn't have that, so if you're not part of the pool, they can't drill under your property, but again, depending on how the fractures run, they can maybe get gas from under your property. So we still want our landowners to be able to lease and be part of the process and get the information from the companies and have something on record as to how things should happen.
Well, this being a different type of horse in Virginia, just VOF. Can you bring me up to date as far as where they're coming from, as far as their feeling on this?
Okay.
We do have forced pooling in Virginia.
And they don't have tax credits for easements in Pennsylvania.
Thank you.
My name is Steve Walker. I'm president of the Northern Neck Land Conservancy, and I live in Westmoreland County. I have a general question for any of you, including Charlie, that might have a guess on what the impact of current events in Russia and the Ukraine might have on this whole issue and its future.
You notice I didn't jump up.
Steve, it's a good question because what you're talking about is, domestic energy, national security. What supplies do we have, and what impact does the United States now make geopolitically around the world? It's a different ball game than it was just a few years ago. What we've seen is, I pointed out to you the brochure, is the enormous growth with natural gas and crude oil coming from places that nobody would have imagined just a few short years ago. And now it's readily available, and it's closer to home. It's more, it's easier to transport because you're not shipping it from around the world. And as far as the natural gas play, it's a cleaner fossil fuel. And there's a big interest in trying to, make a cleaner environment with a cleaner fuel. So, do we have enough to export to these other parts of the world? Well, right now there's prohibitions on exporting crude. We're starting to see a little bit of increase as far as exporting liquid natural gas, because you really have to liquefy it to transport it properly. And now, can that become a player in world events? I think we've seen news this week where there's already legislation trying to make some of this happen. Now, how does that all spin back to the Northern Neck? Well, as I showed you before, we aren't nearly the player that Marcellus Shale is. But, someday, maybe there's enough interest and maybe the technology is advanced enough to make this area a worthwhile play. I mean, there's certainly a need. There's certainly a desire to increase our domestic production. So, who knows? It's a hard question to answer, but that's about the best I can do. Those don't work.
There, it's working now, I think. I think at this point, I'd like to thank our speakers, and I'd really like to do what we've already done here, which is open this up. And at this point, it would be appropriate either for individuals or for any organizations who want to make statements to make them. Pete?
I think I've got exactly that comment, Mr. Slimer. Thank you. Again, Peter Glubiak. I'm an attorney in King William and King and Queen. I have been active in the gas industry for some 15 years. I want to address particularly forced pooling comment. Yes, as Mr. Fisher well knows, Virginia is a forced pool state, and it may sound vaguely unconstitutional, although it's been challenged all over the place. Basically, if a company comes in and leases a certain portion of a unit which has been created, they can basically take the gas from that unit. You can object all you want, but you're going to be called what's called deemed leased, which means whether you like it or not, you're leased. They can lease your gas and take it. The importance of some of this discussion in terms of what you can do and not do is, and we can't possibly get into the rule of capture, and the point is, if they're going to take your neighbor's gas, and they're certainly going to take some of your gas, if you don't have the opportunity, at least on the horizontal directional drilling, which is 7, 8, 9, 10,000 feet in the ground, you're going to lose whatever resource you might have there and lose any opportunity you might have for whatever small royalty you have. So that's an important issue. There are some twists and turns with Tidewater and some of the Chesapeake Bay interactions with law, but the point is, under Virginia law, they can come take your gas. You need to have an opportunity if you have a lease, or if you have an easement, you have to have an opportunity to take advantage of whatever small amount you can have. That's different. I'm not commenting on surface drilling, et cetera, et cetera. What I'm commenting on typically is the horizontal drilling, and from my perspective, that is something that VOF has to strongly consider. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bouliak.
Hello, my name's Linda Muller. I live in Stafford, Virginia, and I want to thank the Virginia Outdoors Foundation for having this forum as well as having the speakers here. I've learned a lot from every panelist. My comments are, it's been evident, it's been repeated again and again by the different panelists that really it's up to what our state regulations allow us to do as well as our local ordinances. And it's interesting to note that in Pennsylvania, they do require well monitoring around a particular region of the drill or the proposed drill, and I don't think that's currently in Virginia. I don't think there is a comfort level with our current regulations that I would even want to consider hydraulic fracturing in our region, especially in conservation easements, which are very special pieces of property meant to be protected from industrial activities. It also requires a lot of water, and even though you can do this without water, as Mr. Ward has pointed out, that's still an option that we don't know will actually be the case. And even if they don't use water, you still have issues of methane migration used by, let's say, gas. I think that in the future, when we're looking at this, we really need to look at what our Virginia state regulations really set out for us, and are they adequate? And I would argue that they are not. And so even to consider having fracking in conservation easements, I'd be particularly concerned. And also, as presented in Ms. Carey's presentation, the amount of work hours involved in a conservation easement that does have drilling activity. I mean, that's something to be considered, because that's money spent somewhere to keep a monitoring and evaluation of that property. Those are just a few of my comments, but again, I want to thank all of you for the considerations this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Muller. Megan?
Hi, my name is Megan Gallagher. I'm from the Plains, Virginia. My family donated one of the first 24 conservation easements in Virginia and went back to it 25 years later and made it much better, got rid of development rights and protected the river through our place. And I've been a Land Trust Executive Director and Founding Director of Virginia Eastern Shore Land Trust. They asked me to read their statement today because it's way far away. I just wanted to reiterate, Renee, I really appreciate how flexible your land trust is in a region in which you have to operate under the principles. And I've pointed out that in Southwest Virginia, I would think that VOF really does have to address the fact that there's a long history and tradition, but I would ask you to rethink how you address landscapes and communities and economies that have no history of this energy extraction and aren't begging you to make it possible. Don't get ahead of the communities you serve. Think of a way in which your conservation goals mirror those of those landscapes. But for the Virginia Eastern Shore Land Trust, which is across the bay, 2 counties, their board met Wednesday and approved this statement. They are, quote, very concerned with the Virginia Outdoors Foundation's approach to conservation easements, permitting the right to explore for and extract hydrocarbons. The board feels that this use of protected land is in direct conflict with the VOF's conservation mission. The Land Trust Board understands that the use may be allowed by IRS code governing easements. However, VOF can and should say no. Virginia taxpayers subsidize acquisition of development rights by providing $100 million in saleable land preservation tax credits every year to easement donors. This investment by taxpayers in support of conservation is viewed as severely threatened by using or allowing a highly controversial technology with potentially severe surface and subsurface environmental impacts. Although the use may be acceptable in the eyes of the IRS, it will never pass the test of public opinion at this time. Although the use may, our concern is that the public will not continue to support editorial, the nation's most generous tax credit program, if protected land may be subsequently redeveloped for this commercial and industrial land use. VOF's allowance of hydrocarbon exploration and development on easement lands consequently threatens the security of the entire tax credit program. VOF has made considerable improvements in its stewardship program. However, it is not in a position to adequately steward hydrocarbon exploration, drilling, and extraction on its easement properties. Reviewing and accepting oil and gas plans, subsequently monitoring the implementation of said plans would require a full staff of highly experienced petroleum geologists, geophysicists, biologists, etc. VOF certainly doesn't have the capacity or funding for this huge task that will undoubtedly have many unforeseen costs, in a large part, costs to the taxpayers of Virginia. The Virginia Eastern Shore Land Trust strongly encourages the VOF board to not consider any more easements with permissive language for hydrocarbon exploration and drilling. Thank you for your consideration of our concerns, signed by John E. Tankard III, the current president. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan.
Hello, my name is Jacob Powell. I'm with Virginia Conservation Network, a network of conservation and environmental groups all across Virginia. So let me get right to the point. Well, first, thank you for having this panel opportunity to discuss this moving forward. We talked a lot about the some of the unknown risks associated with groundwater impacts this morning, and to quote Ms. Wofford here, research and science is still catching up. I think that's very important, but what we also discussed were some of the very real and predictable impacts to the rivers, to the land, and the community. The pollution associated with stormwater runoff, that's going to happen. Further fragmentation of our landscape, that's also going to happen. So I think the question that we have to ask ourselves is, I think the question of this day here is it consistent with the mission of VOF to preserve the natural, scenic, historic, open space, and recreational areas of the Commonwealth? And I do not believe that it is. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Powell. Heather?
Mr. Sahlheimer and Brett and other members of the VOF board who are here today. I'm Heather Richards. I am with the Piedmont Environmental Council. And we respectfully request that the Virginia Outdoors Foundation discontinue its practice of allowing landowners to retain the right to extract oil and gas from the surface of conserved lands when donating a conservation easement, particularly, as Megan has indicated, in areas that have no history of such activity, of such production, and where newer methods of extraction such as hydraulic fracturing are likely. Although the practice of allowing development of oil and gas resources has been in place for at least several years at VOF, we believe that recent changes in the methods of extraction, the impacts of associated infrastructure for the collection and transmission of extracted hydrocarbons, as well as the growth of production in areas not previously subject to this industrial scale energy development, warrant a serious reconsideration of the VOF position. More importantly, the difficult and time-consuming stewardship of easements that allow for such extraction will likely be challenging and tax the already stretched stewardship resources of VOF. VOF was created in 1966 to promote the preservation of open space lands and to preserve the natural, scenic, historic, scientific, open space and recreational areas of the Commonwealth. While economic and industrial activities are an important component of Virginia's economy, they are not necessarily appropriate on conservation lands. In areas where the oil and gas industry has expressed interest in drilling, there is plenty of land not already in conservation easement where those activities may be appropriate on the surface of those properties, if consistent with local planning and zoning. By contrast, there are relatively few areas of the Commonwealth where there are sufficient protections from the impacts of mining and mineral extraction. We believe that extraction of hydrocarbons, particularly natural gas, through hydraulic fracturing is inconsistent with the mission given to VOF by the General Assembly. In areas that already have seen significant drilling, the direct and indirect impacts of these activities goes far beyond the simple well pad and extend to impact an area of up to 30 acres directly or indirectly. Through roads, creation of new edge habitat, pipeline infrastructure. In particular, the impacts on the conservation values often at the core of conservation easements donated to VOF, the protection of open space, scenic, historic, agricultural, and water resources, are at risk from industrial activities associated with drilling and mining. Of particular concern in the Taylorsville Basin is the sensitivity of the Chesapeake Bay watershed and the impact that hydraulic fracturing can have on surface water. According to the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, reasonably anticipated impacts to surface water resources include stormwater runoff, surface spills, leaks, and pit or surface impoundment failures, and waste disposal. The ground disturbance alone, in our opinion, is significant enough to warrant concern by water quality advocates, with at least 3 acres per site open to compaction of soils, impervious surfaces, and erosion concerns. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, we have practical concerns regarding VOF's capacity and expertise to review and approve oil and gas plans and monitor for violations of those plans. As has already been said, VOF has done an extraordinary job stewarding the over 700,000 acres of land you have under conservation easement. But without your own internal team of geologists and mining engineers, VOF will have a hard time making an independent determination as to the veracity of the claims made in oil and gas plans. As we have seen with power lines, railroads, and similar infrastructure projects throughout the Commonwealth, where there's real money on the line, the amount of staff time consumed goes up exponentially. Even with cost recovery language, which has been included in some easements, the burden on an already understaffed stewardship operation could quickly become overwhelming and cause significant system breakdowns. The decision to allow for oil and gas development on lands protected by conservation easements is a serious one, and PEC urges the VOF Board of Trustees to reconsider its position to allow this kind of activity on conserved lands. Thank you very much for holding this forum. We greatly appreciate, as do our conservation partners, the opportunity to make comments and have a dialogue with the VOF Board. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Heather.
Good afternoon. My name is John Tippett. I'm the Executive Director of Friends of the Rappahannock, headquartered here in Fredericksburg. Welcome to our watershed. And I want to speak directly to the issue of today, which is this modern fracking consistent with conservation easements? And at first, though, I want to share with you the perspective that we as nonprofit watershed groups have towards VOF. And that really is that we look to VOF as, to a certain extent, the gold standard in conservation of land and protection of ecosystem services. We do a lot of work to try and get people into your hands because you're the best. Now, looking at the allowed activities, one of the things that strikes me the most is that unlike the permitted activities such as agriculture and silviculture that you allow on easements now, fracking is significantly different in that its effects go beyond the boundary of the parcel in a lot of ways that perhaps we're not thinking about. And certainly in ways that agriculture and silviculture don't. Think about the compressor noise that extends far and wide off of the site. I live 2 miles from a train line, and I hear it every night. The light pollution, where people have probably moved into these rural areas in Essex, for example, to get away from light pollution, and this is going to be going on all night long. The massive traffic, right? So what's happening is you've got it's not just what's there on that parcel, it's the combined effects to the community of all of these trucks bringing and taking out water. The water depletion, again, another offsite beyond the boundary. Where is that water being depleted from? Our already dwindling groundwater reserves? Is it coming from the Rappahannock and therefore changing the salinity regime in a narrow river? And also the scenic issue, which we haven't really talked about a lot. Essex County and all our counties in the Northern Neck are scenic wonders. And when you put a fracking tower right in the middle of that beautiful logo you've got, that really changes things. And also significantly, this creates a situation where a piece of a conservation easement actually becomes an exporter and a generator of pollution. a conservation easement becoming a generator of pollution. And that is very clear in the sense of the water. However many times it might be recycled, it eventually has to go somewhere. And as you've heard, it mostly ends up in deep ground injection. And what a terrible way to deal with our wastes. The ultimate result here, and my concern, our concern for VOF, is that this results in a watering down of the high standard of conservation that all of us expect from your easements, and why we seek you out. And if you were to allow these easements, we share this concern that has been voiced by the past 4 people. How can you have the staff capabilities to oversee the kind of difficult technical things that happen? I saw those hours listed on there, and I just can't imagine, because I've gone and lobbied for funding for VOF when you've been in difficult straits, and I know the limitations you have and limitations on your staff. Where would that money come from? I really wonder about that. And finally, the same thing with the state. You know, DMME, 5 inspectors, and they told us that they were fine for the uranium mining with what they had there, and they're saying they're fine with it with what we've got now to move forward with fracking, and that really, really concerns me. I think we all have significant concerns about the capacity of our state agencies. So in summary, we really feel that conservation easements and fracking are simply incompatible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tippett. Mr. Meyer.
Good afternoon. My name is Larry Bud Meyer. I'm from Rappahannock County, Virginia, the jewel of Virginia, and I'm wearing 2 hats today. I'm a board member for the Rappahannock League for Environmental Protection. We are a membership organization with 180 members. Our board has considered submitting a letter to Secretary Ward, to Charlie and Brett, and I'd like to submit this letter reading only the last paragraph. Fracking is the opposite of conservation and is an insult to true conservationists. The IRS may rule hydraulic fracturing is legal in conservation easements for tax purposes, but it's the wrong thing for Virginia and the VOF. And this is signed by Rick Kohler, the president of RLEP, and I will submit it here to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Meyer.
Charlie, my second hat is that I'm also a recent novelist, and my book...
I was going to mention your
book.
Thank
you.
Of which he's just gifted me a copy.
There we go.
There we go.
Thank you, Charlie, for that shout-out. Mother Fracker is a novel set in Rappahannock County, and before any of this came to our general awareness through the Taylorsville Basin, the George Washington National Forest, etc., I did work up in Pennsylvania with foundations working in the Marcellus Shale on environmental issues. And their concern for what the Marcellus Shale and drilling for natural gas was doing to their communities concerned them greatly. I studied the issue, brought it back, and imagined the unimaginable. Fracking coming to a place like Rappahannock County, one of the top 5 counties in the state of Virginia for conservation. It's a cautionary tale, it's a fun read, but there's a serious purpose behind this book and my understanding of fracking. The industry is well out ahead of where we need to be in understanding the long-term consequences of fracking on human health and the environment. I personally applaud the VOF for taking this, giving this opportunity to study these issues, and I personally support the written letter from our LEP, and I thank you for this opportunity today.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the book. I will look forward to it.
Thank you, Charlie. Rick Parrish with the Southern Environmental Law Center. And I'd like to add my voice to those of Megan, Jacob, Heather, John, all of whom initially thank VOF for putting this forum together and listening to us and sharing information with us from people who've been out in the field and observed these operations. And I want to add my voice to theirs to suggest that the level of industrial activity associated with fracking, and it's obviously not just the drilling and the fracking itself, it's the road construction, the pipeline installation, the compressor station operations, the pump houses operating around the clock and sometimes for 20, perhaps 30 years, just don't seem consistent with the conservation values embedded in the conservation easements that VOF holds, much to our delight that you do hold them. So I really would add my voice to those who encourage you simply to leave those leases on the table, continue negotiating, find a way around, if possible, the desire to frack and conserve, if that's really the proper phrasing, because many of us really don't think that's an option. Especially in this region, as many people have said already today, where there's simply not a history of resource extraction of this nature. And local governments are simply not prepared to deal with it. They are recognizing the potential coming onslaught, and they are starting to ask the right questions and take steps in the right direction, but they're just starting that path. DMME may think that it has everything perfectly under control. They've never dealt with this kind of activity in this kind of region. They haven't got a plan for wastewater disposal, for instance, that would protect the bay. So you've got local governments, state governments, you've got EPA in the third year now of a national study of the pros and cons of hydraulic fracturing of natural gas. We need to at least wait, at a minimum, to see what the serious investigations of these operations, how they end up, and what kind of recommendations the different levels of government can take to prepare us to deal with this activity. DMME, for instance, now has an open regulatory review process to consider amending all of its regs to ensure the gas and oil regulations reflect industry best practices, which they don't at this time, and to expand disclosure of ingredients used in the gas and oil well stimulation or fracking process. So there's an awful lot of moving parts right now, and I think it's best that VOF step back and let those parts settle out in the years to come, and then perhaps address this issue again. And then I want to make one very brief comment about forced pooling in Virginia. Yes, it is the law that it's allowed, but there's a specific provision of the Code of Virginia addressing gas and oil drilling in the tidewater area, which is defined to include the Taylorsville Basin, which addresses lateral drilling, not the conventional, typical horizontal, vertical well, thank you, but the lateral drilling. You cannot drill under someone else's property without their permission. Now, it may be that under a forced pooling order elsewhere in the state, you may be able to do that. Frankly, I don't think that's settled law, because under common law, that's a trespass. You're not allowed to enter someone else's land on foot or by drill without their permission. So I just want to make sure people understand collectively, there are some very open issues about that, and there is some added protection to property rights in this area that we have to take into consideration when considering whether you're going to be forced to join that kind of a production unit. Thank you.
Rick, thank you very much. We appreciate what your fine organization does for the environment here and up and down the coast. Thank you.
My name is Kim Sandom, and I work with Rockingham County. I'm the executive director of a citizens group there that works on land use and transportation issues only in Rockingham, but many of our issues are the same issues as are faced in other parts of the state. Thank you for having this opportunity to learn and to give comment. Many of my concerns and comments have already been stated by other speakers, like the PEC and the Eastern Shore Statement, so I won't repeat those. But I do want to just point out that in the Shenandoah Valley, farmers are jumping through all kinds of hoops to deal with sediment issues, to address the Chesapeake Bay, above and beyond things that maybe even sometimes make common sense. But this industry has such a footprint with erosion. I had an opportunity to visit Wetzel County, West Virginia, and Washington County, so I've seen this firsthand. And one of the two major things that impacted me was the erosion that goes with this issue. So I think this is completely incompatible with conservation, and I hope you will consider that as you address your new rules. Again, thinking from the perspective of the farmers in the Shenandoah Valley and the rules that they have to jump through to try and address erosion and the impact that would be overrun by this industry. There's a little bit of caution in the county that I work in with the idea of conservation easements. We're tiptoeing into it. It's not a real comfortable, familiar kind of concept for a lot of folks in our area. But our county has put together a citizens committee, and we worked on a PDR ordinance that's sitting on the shelf right now. And what you do today, or as you decide this issue, will impact how people perceive conservation easements, not just what VOF does. And I know that's a side issue in a way for you all, but it's an important side issue, I would say. It deals with how people perceive conservation and conservation easements apart from just VOF. And I would encourage you to keep that in mind, because we think there are some great places in the Shenandoah Valley to preserve. And I would really hate for the idea of conservation itself to be seen as a Trojan horse for fracking, which is not supported in our community. And finally, I would say that the communities that I had a chance to visit that either have state or local resources to address conservation find themselves in a cat and mouse situation many times with the industry in trying to enforce regulations. And I would guess that the state regulatory agencies have more resources than you all do for enforcement. And so I would encourage you to protect yourself from a really awful situation by not putting yourself in a situation where you have to enforce with very little resources. And again, I think the clear answer would be to not include them in fracking in your easements. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Sandham.
My name's Kenneth Snow, and I'm a landman for Shore. And it's something I do want to say right off. I'm not trained in geology or petroleum engineering, or my training is searching title records in courthouses. But there are several things that I do want to clear, just to clarify all the talk about hydrofracking and water, and then salt water to dispose of, and so on. The Taylorsville Basin is a Triassic basin, and this Triassic basin is a Triassic rift basin. What a rift basin means is it was torn apart, it was rifted back in early in Earth's history when Pangea broke up into the various continents. In fact, there's a place that you can look at right now where that's taking place on Earth. That's Lake Tanganyika in Africa. These plates are moving. If they continue to move the way they are, someday Africa, in the Earth's geological future, is going to be separated into two parts. Lake Tanganyika is about 200 miles long, 50 miles wide, and close to 2,000 feet deep. Well, in studying it, they have discovered there's no oxygen at the bottom. And so it's something that if organic matter dies and settles to the bottom and mixes with the sediments that come in there, and the muck that builds up over the bottom is extremely rich in organic matter. But there's no salt there. It is not a prehistoric ocean floor, as most of the production in the United States is, from what I understand. this is a freshwater lake bed. Sometime in Earth's distant geologic future, the Taylor's, this Lake Tanganyika is going to be a source of oil and gas. Well, that's what we're dealing with here, is a rift basin that with these, they say these plates move apart about an inch a year. So it's a very, very slow, long process. So it created these big cracks that filled up with sediments. And they're freshwater lakes, and it's entirely a different thing than saltwater shale. And so it's something that we don't have a lot of the problems that you have in saltwater shale, but a problem that you do have with this type of sediment is that fresh water can turn that into mud. And it's something that you simply, it's an absolute mistake from what I understand to do hydraulic or hydrofracking. To do hydrofracking and introduce water into this formation is going to seal off any oil and gas. You have to use gas fracking. And so much of the dialogue has been the water this, the water that. Bring the water in, get rid of the water's polluted. Well, we say it again and again, and I have to apologize. I don't think we've gotten it across that this is something that we have to use a nitrogen, probably a nitrogen frac. And nitrogen, that's yet to be determined, but they definitely want to use a gas frac. And nitrogen is in the air that we're breathing right now. It's not something that's going to kill us. But anyway, and I did want to say thank you to Renee and her presentation. I really was glad that you showed some pictures of what it looks like after, because there were test wells were drilled here in the 1980s, and I've been to some of these sites within the last year or two and had a landowner. I said, can you show me where the well was drilled? And, you know, one gentleman who's almost 90 years old had this gator that he took me on this rollicking ride way out to his land, in his land to a field. He said it was somewhere over in there. You can't see exactly where. I couldn't tell you exactly X marks the spot, but it was somewhere over in there was where they drilled that well. And so it's something that I realize that it is like Mr. Ward said, it is an industrial site when it's going in, but it doesn't stay an industrial site. And it's something that that does go away. I mean, and that's just a fact of life. If you want a new skyscraper in the middle of a downtown area, people have to live if that's with it for a while. But then one day they've got a beautiful new edifice of some type or whatever. So it is something that I really appreciate you showing, that after the fact, you don't have the scars that you do have during the fact. And it is true, while they're drilling or fracking, it is an industrial site. That's absolutely for sure. But I really want to emphasize the fact that this is a Triassic basin. Google it. Look up Triassic Basin. It's a part of the Newark supergroup. There are all kinds of Triassic basins that were created when the continents broke apart. And some of them have a potential for oil. Some of them don't. And part of that's based on where they feel, how far north it was. If it was in a place that was too cold, well, that Triassic Basin probably doesn't have a lot of the organic matter necessary to create the oil. If it was in a warm place during the Triassic era, then it does. And so it's something that we chose to come back to Taylorsville because we had all this information from a number of wells that were drilled in the past, in the 1980s. And we had hundreds of miles of seismic information that was done here. But you know, it is really something for a place to consider. You know, there's tremendous economic advantage that can come with oil and gas production, but it's also something to think about if a community or an area wants that economic growth that can bring. but it's because there's over 500,000 square miles of shale in the United States. There are 20 states in the United States that are believed to have are producible quantities of shale in them. And some of them welcome people with open arms. I think it's kind of interesting. The state of Georgia has got a $250,000 bounty on the first person who can produce a successful oil and gas well. And I've had several people roll their eyes when I mentioned that, yeah, you're going to spend $10 million to get a $250,000 bounty, or maybe $20 million, whatever it costs to put a project together and how big you want to make it. But the thing of it is, the shale in Georgia is in the northwestern part of the state. There are lakes up there that provide the drinking water for metropolitan Atlanta area, one of the biggest, most populous areas that you could find anywhere. And it's something, so they're saying the state of Georgia has got very strict environmental rules that have to be complied with, but they're also saying with open arms, come and let's see if we can safely find some oil and gas and everybody make a lot of money out of it and have a lot of tax relief in the state and what have you, all the things that come along with it. And so, you know, there are all kinds of places where people can look. But we chose here because well, for one reason, that this is a Triassic basin. That's not a Triassic basin. This is a prehistoric freshwater lake bed. You don't have to deal with the salt water and the things that you have to deal with if you're in a typical shale formation. So
Thank you,
anyway,
Mr.
I think
Snow.
I've taken up more
Thank
of my
you.
time. So thank you.
Again, I'm Bobby Lamb, and I have an easement in Spotsylvania County with VOF, and I have reserved the oil and gas rights, so I don't have a lease of that. I just wanted to, in light of some of the comments about VOF being suggested to VOF that they not allow such things on easement properties, that I think VOF has to look very carefully at their power that they might enjoy as a state agency. Because after all, it is a policy of the Commonwealth of Virginia to develop its oil and gas resources. To the extent that VOF has a policy that's contrary to that, as a state agency, it might be doing something in derogation of state policy. So it'd be different if, for example, a private conservation group made an arrangement. But I think the VOF, as a state agency, should be precluded from coming up with policies that in effect block oil and gas activities on properties, particularly when you consider that under the Internal Revenue Code, it is a permissible aspect of what constitutes a conservation easement. And lastly, I'd like to briefly speak to what was said before about one of the gentlemen, I think, from the Southern Environmental Law Center, said that perhaps you ought to wait until the study on hydraulic fracturing came out. Well, there's an opinion of the Attorney General near the end of 2012 that suggested when the Washington County tried to use that tactic as an excuse for delaying certain activities which otherwise would be permissible, that the Attorney General said that that has the effect, even though it's not worded as a ban, it operates as a temporary ban of that kind of activity. So I think waiting until some study, which invariably studies don't come out as quickly as they should, they delay for one reason or t'other, I think that would be an improper power as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lamb. I think at this point, I'd just like to make a couple comments. First of all, in direct response to Mr. Lamb, we're the Virginia Outdoors Foundation, and I think I can speak for the board, is not opposed to oil and gas per se, but we are, as some other speakers have pointed out, we are very much aware of our role as a leader in the conservation community of Virginia, and we are interested in seeing that both the reputation of VOF and the way that we treat our land and our environment and our waters are the decisions that are made very carefully. That's the reason for this forum today, and that's the reason that we're taking as much time as we are in trying to come to some conclusion. I said in the beginning that this is a learning process for me, for our board, for our staff, and hopefully for everybody in this room. It's something that's new. I guess if we were in Texas or North Dakota or somewhere else, it might be old hat, but it's new for us. We have different environmental challenges, and as an organization, we have another challenge that, as has been pointed out, is not true for a private environmental organization, which can and should at this point, in my opinion, personally, be opposed to oil and gas drilling, fracking, or anything of this sort, because I don't know that it is safe at this point in time, and that's the position that they can take. We are trying to reach a conclusion because our easements are in perpetuity, and I can remember a former wonderful friend of mine and chairman of PEC said, you know, perpetuity is, he said, he was at the time about 60 years old, and there was a question of whether there was whether at that time, you know, easements were taken that were 30-year easements. And there's some of those on the books from the mid-60s after this organization was first created. And he said, well, they said, should it be 30 years, 50 years, or perpetuity? And he lowered his glasses and said, I don't know about the rest of the people in this room, but for me, it doesn't matter. 30, 50, or perpetuity are all the same. Perpetuity is a long, long time. And we want to make sure that the decisions that we make today to tie up properties are not going to be things that we regret in the future. On the other hand, we certainly don't want to endanger the environment. And that is a great challenge that we have. There is, I would say, a very strong sentiment of the board that we don't believe and have never believed that fracking today is a safe way of extracting oil and gas. We have not yet, we're trying to find a way where it might be a safe way of extraction. But we do not have fracking on any of our properties today, nor is it our real sentiment or intention to have fracking on those properties immediately. But we're trying to get help from all of you. We would welcome your comments in writing or otherwise. We thank you for your comments today. We're looking for your comments in trying to develop a policy. I don't know that that will happen at our next board meeting, but certainly it would help to get any of your comments before our next meeting is April the 22nd, and it would help to get your comments by that time. I think that's about what I wanted to say. Brett, let me turn this over to the real boss of the organization. Brett.
Thank you, Charlie. Yes, I would encourage you to submit any written or additional comments to Jason McGarvey. He is our communications manager, and he is in this room. Jason, can you, there he is. If you wouldn't mind making available your business cards so that people, they're on the table to the left and the back, so that people can continue to submit comments or ask questions. I'd like to let Mr. DeJarnette come up to the mic and make one last final comment. He's been waiting very patiently, and after that we will conclude the meeting. And again, thank you all for coming out here today, and I look forward to additional input. And please see Jason on your way out to get his card. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Cliff. I would like to advance an argument which I haven't heard so far today, which is I would like to see VOF increase the amount of land it has under easement. Philip Reed knows that I'm a part of a group of people on the Pamunkey River who cooperated in establishing easements of that very valuable and pristine river, which I started hunting on in 1945. I would like my children and grandchildren to see something that I saw. But changing the subject, if you want to have people that we have leases with sign an easement, whip a pad, we shore, to subrogate our interest and negotiate with the VOF to find something that would give you some control. If we have a lease already and they want to get an easement, we're prepared to discuss that as well. If you have the easement and we want to lease and the landowner wants to lease, we're prepared to agree to no surface access. In other words, the question is the VOF interested in having a large number of property owners in that area of Virginia, the Middle Peninsula and the Northern Neck, as people that you have easements with or not? Now, I would like to see that. I think I mentioned earlier, I'm a resident of Ashland, which is not in the Taylorsville Basin, but it's near. Taylorsville Baptist Church is the name that was given to the Taylorsville Basin. That's about a mile from Ashland. And our family farm that my wife and I own is in southern Caroline County. And about 15 years ago, when I left the State Department, I tried to work out an easement with the VOF. And I had the land assessed. And the results was that it was more valuable with a VOF easement than without. That led me to reconsider my decision because there wasn't a lot of money that was going to result from that. Now, people like me who are not big landowners, or there are many of us in Carolina who have farms, would like to keep them in the family, would like our children to live on them, at least part of the time, come back and have jobs. They in fact, would like to keep their family farms. They can't do it if they don't find some source of income. Now, very few people farm anymore in Caroline County. They rent the land they farm, and they farm thousands of acres. And that's possible today. But that's not a sustainable environmental program. People who have those farms are going to have to find some kind of other income. VOF may be a possibility. It doesn't work very well in southern Caroline County because of the zoning, but it might work in other parts of the Taylorsville Basin. I think it's in fact, synergistic thing for the VOF and Shore to cooperate so that we can get as many people to give us a lease under different kinds of conditions that we're prepared to negotiate, and as many people as possible to give the VOF some control of that part of Virginia in perpetuity. Now, I hope it's developed in the Taylorsville Basin. It will give at least a couple of generations the opportunity to stay on the land. It will benefit all of the citizens of that area. That area needs help. Nobody today has spoken about a jobs program for Caroline County. There is none. People like me, children grow up and go away. And they work in the city and they don't come back. I would like to see that part of Virginia, in fact, be as close to what it is today for my children and their children and for a long time. And we can do that if we cooperate. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. DeJarnette. And thank you for your cooperation on some easements that you have had leases on. I should mention that. Thank you very much.
And a hearty thanks to all of our presenters today, some of who traveled from out of state and from the Valley. We thank you so very much for coming here today. We appreciate your participation, and we feel that this has been a very successful meeting. So one last round of applause for our presenters. Thank you again.